A flight attendant mocked a young black boy's suit in first class. Seconds later, he learned the boy's father was the airline's CEO, and what happened next will leave you speechless. He mocked a young boy's suit in first class, laughing that kids like you don't dress like that. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on skin color. The glass doors of Vailport International Airport slid open with a soft hiss, letting in the golden wash of morning light that spilled across the marble floors. 11-year-old Caden Marin stepped through them with quiet confidence. His small but poised frame dressed in a crisp navy suit, polished black shoes, and a golden tie clip that caught the light like a secret. The handle of his miniature leather briefcase clicked softly as he adjusted it, his fingers tight around the grip not out of fear, but discipline. Around him, travelers bustled past in a blur of backpacks, duffel bags, and tired faces, but Caden walked with a practiced calm, as if every step was part of a well-rehearsed routine. From a distance, a man watched, tall, composed, face unreadable but eyes sharp beneath the soft light. Damon Marin stood with his hands folded in front of him, a simple watch on his wrist and no trace of his power visible to anyone in the terminal. To most, he looked like any other well-dressed businessman. But inside Skyreach Airways, his decisions echoed in every corridor, every route, every terminal screen flickering with flight schedules. He hadn't come to play the CEO today. Today, he was simply a father, one who had decided to reward his son not with toys or trips to amusement parks, but with access. Access to the world he had built from nothing but grit and precision. Caden had earned this. Damon had made sure of that. Inside the first-class lounge, silence reigned beneath the soft hum of conversation and the distant sound of piano music playing over hidden speakers. Waiters in dark vests moved like shadows, setting down glasses of orange juice and silver trays of breakfast rolls without disturbing the air. Caden chose a seat near the large window that overlooked the tarmac. His eyes, intelligent and observant, followed the slow taxi of a Skyreach jet as it curved toward the runway. He did not fidget. He did not slouch. He simply sat, legs crossed at the ankle, briefcase on his lap, watching with a sense of wonder he refused to show too easily. Damon remained at a distance, standing by a frosted glass wall speaking briefly with an airport coordinator. Even from there, he kept one eye on his son, gauging his posture, his breath, his control. Caden didn't know it, but this was not only a gift, it was a test. "Final boarding call for Flight 827 to Ardent City," the loudspeaker announced, crisp and emotionless. Caden stood and smoothed his blazer, breathing deeply. As he moved toward the gate, he felt the subtle pressure of eyes turning his way. An older man in a business suit did a double-take. A teenage boy nudged his brother and whispered something with a grin. Caden had grown used to these looks, part admiration, part confusion, and sometimes part scorn. He walked anyway. A gate agent took his ticket without comment, though his brow raised slightly when he saw the name. "Boarding alone today, Mr. Marin?" the agent asked. "Yes, sir," Caden replied with careful politeness. The man gave a brief smile, handing the stub back with a quiet nod. "Enjoy your flight." Caden stepped onto the jet bridge, the metal floor vibrating faintly beneath his shoes. The air changed, cooler now, tinged with jet fuel and recycled chill. As he approached the aircraft door, a tall man in a tailored uniform leaned out of the entryway. His name tag gleamed under the overhead light. Trevor Knox, senior attendant. Trevor's eyes scanned the boy, pausing on the briefcase, the suit, the tie clip. The corner of his mouth lifted in the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be kind. "Big meeting today, little man," Trevor said, voice just light enough to sound playful but with a sharp edge hiding underneath. Caden blinked, pausing in the doorway, unsure if the question was serious. He answered softly, "Just traveling, sir." Trevor chuckled. "Right. First class must be running a daycare now." A soft laugh escaped from a nearby row, and someone muttered, "That's a new one." Caden's ears burned, but his spine didn't bend. He simply walked forward, finding his seat near the window. Behind him, Trevor turned to another attendant, muttering under his breath, "Miniature businessman, huh?" Hope he brought crayons for the stock charts. The other attendant, Felix, much younger, still green, looked unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. He didn't respond. Trevor didn't care. Caden sat down, placing his briefcase gently on his lap. Outside the window, another Skyreach plane rolled by, its silver hull glinting in the morning sun. He kept his eyes on it, willing the sting in his chest to disappear. His father's words echoed faintly in his mind, words said often in quiet moments when no one else was listening. Dignity doesn't depend on who's watching. It depends on who you are when no one's applauding. He repeated the phrase silently to himself as the plane door closed and the cabin filled with the sound of safety announcements. He didn't know yet that Damon had boarded behind him. He didn't know that Trevor's words would come back to haunt him. He didn't even know that this flight, which was supposed to be a reward, would uncover something darker, hiding beneath the uniform of a man who thought status gave him the right to judge. But something inside Caden, some quiet voice that refused to break, kept him still, even as the seatbelt sign dinged overhead. Not all lessons in power begin in offices. Some start at 30,000 feet. The moment Caden Marin stepped through the narrow entryway of the aircraft, the temperature of the air seemed to shift, not in climate, but in energy. The sleek cabin buzzed with soft conversation and the rustle of newspapers and tablets, but it all seemed to pause for a fraction of a second when a boy in a Navy suit crossed the threshold of first class. Trevor Knox, a tall, sharp-featured flight attendant with a fixed smirk and shoulders that always seemed a bit too stiff for his frame, looked up from his checklist. His eyes landed on the boy's polished shoes first, then slowly traveled upward. Dark slacks neatly pressed, blazer perfectly tailored, and a golden tie clip glinting under the cabin lights. The attendant blinked once, and then his lips curled into a slow, condescending smile. "Big meeting today, little man," Trevor said, his tone casual but sharpened just enough to slice through the quiet of the aisle. His voice wasn't loud but deliberate, calculated to carry just enough for the gentleman in seat 3B and the suited passenger flipping through a magazine in 4A to hear. Caden stopped, one hand gripping the handle of his compact briefcase. He blinked, startled but not confused. He knew sarcasm when he heard it. He'd grown up hearing it whispered behind his back in places where children weren't expected to carry themselves like adults. Swallowing the sting, he met Trevor's eyes with an unsure but respectful reply. "Just traveling, sir." His voice was calm but soft, like a candle trying to hold against the wind. Trevor chuckled, shaking his head as he turned slightly toward a nearby passenger, as if inviting them to share in the joke. "Right," he muttered, just loud enough again. "First class must be running a daycare now." A few passengers snickered quietly. The man in 3B cleared his throat, hiding a chuckle behind a polite cough. Another shifted in his seat, offering a sideways glance at the boy, as if trying to figure out if he was part of some marketing stunt. Caden's face flushed with heat. He lowered his eyes, the polished tips of his shoes suddenly more interesting than the luxury around him. He felt the tight knot in his chest begin to twist, but he bit the inside of his cheek, willing himself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of strangers who saw a costume instead of character. Behind him, the soft hum of boarding continued. Men with briefcases walked by, murmuring into phones. A few attendants further down the aisle checked tickets and pointed to leather seats, oblivious to the small drama unfolding at the front of the cabin. Damon Marin, still at the counter finalizing a quiet request with the agent, his presence carefully kept under wraps, remained unaware of the insult aimed at his son. Trevor moved down the aisle with the practiced pace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times but cared less each day. He stopped near Felix, a younger crew member shadowing him for training, and leaned in with the air of someone about to share a joke too clever to keep to himself. "Look at that kid," Trevor whispered, nodding toward Caden, now settling into seat 2A. "Miniature businessman. Probably thinks he's running a Fortune 500 out of a treehouse. Felix hesitated, eyebrows twitching upward. His instincts told him the comment was off, but Trevor's smirk pulled at him like gravity. He gave a nervous chuckle, more out of survival than agreement. "Must be Halloween early," Trevor added, adjusting his tie and shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Costume parties in the sky now." As they passed, Caden sat with his back straight, his hands clasped around the leather handle of his briefcase. He could feel the glances like static on his skin. He kept his eyes on the window, willing the plane to take off already. His throat felt tight, and for a moment he wished he had just worn regular clothes. But then he remembered his father's voice from a conversation weeks ago, spoken not as a lecture, but as a principle. Dignity doesn't depend on who's watching, it depends on who you are when no one's applauding. Caden exhaled slowly, letting the words settle in his chest. He tightened his grip on the briefcase and lifted his chin slightly, keeping his focus on the tarmac. Outside, planes taxied across runways in orderly rows, mechanical giants waiting for permission to rise. Inside, he remained still, refusing to shrink, even as the laughter faded behind him. Back at the galley, Trevor continued muttering under his breath, dropping sarcastic comments whenever he caught sight of Caden. "Boardroom baby," he whispered at one point, tossing a smirk toward Felix again. "Probably has his juice labeled executive blend." Felix shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He looked toward Caden, then back at Trevor. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. The boy wasn't causing a scene. He wasn't bragging or even speaking. He was just sitting there, trying to exist in a space that others believed didn't belong to him. But Felix said nothing. Not yet. As Trevor walked past Caden's row again, he caught the boy's eye and offered a theatrical wink. "Don't worry, kid," he said mockingly. "We'll try not to disturb your very important meetings." Caden didn't respond. He didn't flinch. He simply turned back toward the window. Trevor's smirk deepened, mistaking the boy's silence for defeat. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the flight manifest held a name that would soon unravel every assumption he'd made. Damon Marin, Seat 1A. The boy he ridiculed was not only the son of Skyreach's elusive CEO, but the quiet center of a storm about to come. The plane continued to board, oblivious to the crack that had just formed in the calm. Somewhere far below the luxury of the cabin, wheels were already turning and fates shifting. Sometimes, silence plants the seed of revelation. Caden took his seat near the window, clutching his small briefcase, the one his father had given him, engraved with the initials KM. The leather was smooth and firm, just like the one Damon carried to board meetings. Caden laid it gently on his lap, his fingers brushing the monogram for reassurance. He didn't look around, didn't crane his neck to see who was watching, but he felt it. The weight of eyes, the ripple of quiet amusement moving through the cabin like a breeze that chills more than it stirs. Across the aisle, Trevor Knox lingered near a pair of businessmen, pretending to adjust a coffee pot on the galley cart. His voice lowered to a murmur, but his words carried just far enough. "Look at that, probably trying to impress someone," he said, gesturing with a slight jerk of his chin toward Caden. "Kid doesn't even know which fork to use." The businessman in seat 2D snorted into his newspaper. The man beside him offered a crooked smile, clearly amused. Trevor's smirk widened, pleased by the reaction. Behind him, the younger flight attendant, Felix, fidgeted with a napkin stack. His hands hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the boy in the window seat. Felix tried to laugh, but it came out half-hearted, more a breath than a sound. "You think he's flying alone?" he asked, unsure whether he was actually curious or just trying to play along. Trevor leaned in closer. "I saw him walk in by himself. Probably some kind of VIP's kid, maybe here for a special day out." His tone oozed mockery disguised as casual chat. "Bet he orders sparkling water and calls it champagne." Caden sat motionless, but he heard everything. He didn't turn around. He didn't frown. Instead, he blinked slowly, fighting the sting behind his eyes. The seatbelt buckle dug lightly into his side, but the discomfort was nothing compared to the hollow twist inside his chest. His small fingers tightened on the briefcase. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the boarding process wound down, casting warm gold across the tops of the headrests. Somewhere behind him, a child giggled. Someone else unwrapped a sandwich. The everyday sounds of travel, the shuffle of bags, the rustle of safety cards, muffled the sharp edge of the words still echoing in Caden's mind. He recalled a recent afternoon on the Skyreach balcony, standing beside his father as sunlight reflected off the glass tower of the executive wing. Damon had said something then, when a senior executive had fumbled a public comment about real leadership. Caden remembered the line like it was engraved inside him. "Dignity doesn't depend on who's watching," his father had said, eyes fixed on the skyline. "It depends on who you are when no one's applauding." Caden let the memory settle around him like armor. He adjusted his lapel and smoothed the sleeves of his suit. The navy fabric didn't hang awkwardly, it was tailored for him. The golden tie clip gleamed faintly beneath the cabin lights. Still, whispers continued, soft, stinging, weightless to those who tossed them, but heavy to the boy who carried them. A man across the aisle peered at Caden, lips curled in a half-amused grin. Caden met his gaze only briefly, then turned toward the window, hiding the tremble in his lower lip. Near the galley, Felix hesitated, a plastic tray in hand, eyes darting between the passengers and his senior. The laughter hadn't stopped, but it had shifted, less amused, more uncertain. Felix noticed the slight tension in Caden's shoulders, the way the boy sat a little too straight, as if holding himself together by posture alone. "I think maybe we should ease off," Felix muttered under his breath. Trevor rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, don't go soft now. You're new, but let me tell you, these entitled kids fly once in a suit and think they own the sky." Felix said nothing. He turned away to distribute drinks, but his pace slowed. Something about Caden's silence was bothering him. A few rows back, the first-class curtain swayed as a final passenger stepped through the doorway. The man wore a light gray blazer over a dark shirt, no flashy logos or bold colors. He carried himself with quiet confidence, unhurried, composed, unreadable. The captain greeted him with a slight nod. The manifest had listed him as Damon Marin, seat 1A. Trevor didn't notice him bored. His attention was still on the boy he thought was alone, the boy he had mistaken for an easy target. Caden remained still, gaze fixed on the endless sky beyond the window. He heard footsteps, but didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in the air, familiar, grounding. Something had changed. And somewhere nearby, fate had already stepped through the cabin door, wrapped in the quiet stride of a man used to watching from the shadows until the right moment came to speak. Mockery thrives in ignorance until truth boards the plane. "Sir, we ask that parents avoid crowding the aisles. Some passengers are waiting." The words fell with sharp disrespect, slicing through the hum of settling travelers and the soft chime of the boarding announcement. Damon Marin slowly turned his head, rising to his full height with deliberate calm. His expression didn't shift, no raised voice, no flare of emotion, only eyes that sharpened like cold steel. The man standing before him wore the polished uniform of a first-class flight attendant, but his voice was steeped in arrogance. Trevor Knox. He stood tall, chin slightly raised as if daring confrontation, but his smirk faltered for just a second when he met Damon's eyes. Damon didn't reply right away. Instead, he adjusted the collar of his gray blazer, then leaned forward to fasten the seatbelt around the small boy seated near the window. Caden. The boy's smile trembled at the edges, trying to stay in place, but Damon saw past it. Caden's posture was too stiff, too rehearsed for a child who should have been thrilled about the journey ahead. His son, always composed beyond his years, now seemed like he was bracing against something unseen, but not unfelt. Damon spoke at last, his voice smooth but edged with quiet authority. "Of course." He stepped aside, allowing the aisle to clear, though the truth was that no one had been waiting behind him. Trevor offered a final sneer. First-class privileges, I guess, before striding off, clearly pleased with his own performance. His shoes clicked confidently down the aisle as if he had scored some invisible victory. Felix, the younger attendant trailing behind, shot a quick glance back. His brow furrowed, and though he said nothing, his discomfort was obvious. Damon made note of it. Small gestures often revealed the bigger story. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the captain's voice filtered through the intercom, announcing the final preparations for takeoff. Damon remained standing a moment longer, hand resting gently on Caden's shoulder. The engines began to hum, the vibrations growing into a steady, low rumble beneath the soles of his shoes. He wasn't angry. Not yet. What he felt was something far more dangerous. The familiar calculation of a man who had learned, over years of boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations, how to recognize threat hiding beneath the mask of protocol. Trevor's tone hadn't been casual. His sarcasm wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was targeted, intentional. Damon sat back in his own seat, diagonally across from Caden, and buckled in with precision. His gaze stayed forward, but his mind was already racing. He could feel it, that undercurrent of disrespect, the kind that rarely showed itself to power unless it believed power wasn't watching. Trevor didn't know who he was. That much was clear. He thought Damon was just another parent, a well-dressed man traveling with a child who, perhaps, didn't belong in a space traditionally ruled by suits, spreadsheets, and self-importance. But Damon hadn't built Skyreach Airways by demanding attention. He had built it by watching silently, learning patterns, identifying weak points, and then striking when the timing was right. He turned slightly and looked at his son. Caden sat with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his briefcase perched beside him like a loyal companion. The golden tie clip Damon had gifted him shimmered under the cabin lights, a small but noble mark of confidence. Yet the boy's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the safety card he wasn't really reading. Damon leaned in, speaking low, just above the noise of the engines. "Everything all right, champ?" Caden looked up, startled from thought. He hesitated. His lips parted, then pressed together again. Before the boy could speak, Trevor reappeared, almost as if summoned by the moment. "Sir," he said again, more forcefully this time, "we're preparing for takeoff. Please remain seated." He nodded pointedly at Damon, like an officer reminding a suspect of the rules. Damon's eyes didn't leave the man's face. "I'm seated," he replied coolly, though the sharpness of his stare made the air around them feel colder. Trevor opened his mouth as if to respond, but Felix gently touched his elbow. "Let's finish up in the galley," the younger attendant urged under his breath. With an exaggerated sigh, Trevor walked off. Damon exhaled slowly. His fingers drummed once on the armrest. This wasn't about his son's clothing. It wasn't even about a narrow aisle. This was about entitlement, the kind that disguises itself as authority, the kind that festers in places where power isn't questioned. The fasten seatbelt signs lit up. The engines roared louder, pushing the aircraft forward. Caden turned to look out the window as the runway lights streaked past. Damon sat back, eyes closed for a moment, but not in rest. He knew that look Trevor had worn. He had seen it countless times from board members who tried to smile while pulling knives, from partners who shook hands while plotting against him, from competitors who underestimated quiet strength. He had seen it in places that were supposed to be fair, yet often weren't. He opened his eyes again, calm as ever, but his mind had already begun measuring steps, marking moments. He wouldn't cause a scene. He wouldn't raise his voice. But he would remember. Because men like Trevor didn't just reveal themselves in words. They revealed themselves in how they treated those they thought were beneath them. and Damon Marin had never believed in letting rot go unchecked, especially not on the planes bearing his legacy. From the window, clouds began to swallow the city skyline, and the hum of the jet leveled into a smooth, cruising rhythm. But tension still hovered, silent but heavy. Damon didn't look back. He didn't need to. He already knew that the air may have lifted them, but gravity had yet to pull the truth down. The coffee pot tilted, and the moment seemed to slow. Trevor Knox's tray jolted as the plane dipped ever so slightly, just enough for the steaming liquid to slosh dangerously close to Caden Marin's lap. The young boy instinctively flinched backward in his seat, pulling his legs up just in time to avoid the worst of the spill. A few drops darkened the crisp fold of his navy pants, but the real danger had missed him by inches. Trevor's face twisted in annoyance as the turbulence rattled the cabin briefly, his grip tightening around the edge of the tray. "Great," he muttered under his breath, scowling at the tray like it had betrayed him. "Guess I was right. This is no place for kids." The comment, low but sharp, cut deeper than the heat of the coffee ever could have. Caden didn't say a word. He sat perfectly still, hands pressed against the briefcase in his lap, knuckles pale from tension. He didn't cry. He didn't look away. But inside, the storm had started. Across the aisle, Damon Marin closed the leather folder he had been pretending to read. His eyes, calm but cold, lifted slowly to meet the back of Trevor's head. The man still hadn't noticed him, hadn't realized the quiet presence watching everything, waiting. Damon's fingers hovered over the armrest for a heartbeat, then dropped purposefully to the call button at his side. A soft ding rang out. Trevor didn't turn. "Excuse me," Damon said clearly, his voice polite but edged with steel. Trevor finally spun around, trying to maintain his usual air of superiority. "Yes, sir." His tone was clipped, his jaw tight from the embarrassment of the spill. Damon gestured toward his son without rising. "I believe you just narrowly avoided burning this young passenger." "I'd like an explanation," Trevor scoffed lightly, brushing off the concern with a forced chuckle. "Turbulence, sir. Happens all the time. Maybe if he weren't sitting like he owned the plane." His words trailed off under the weight of Damon's unblinking stare. Silence fell over the nearby passengers. One man paused mid-sip of his drink. A woman lowered her tablet, sensing something more serious unfolding. Caden's eyes flicked to his father's face. Damon's jaw was set, but he gave no outward sign of anger. Not yet. "Are you suggesting this incident was the fault of an 11-year-old boy?" Damon asked quietly. Trevor hesitated. The tray in his hands suddenly felt heavier. "I'm suggesting," he said slowly, "that perhaps first class wasn't designed for dress up." Caden felt something twist in his stomach. Trevor caught himself, tried to smile, but it came out wrong, crooked, tense. "I only meant it as a bit of humor." Felix, the younger attendant nearby, shifted uncomfortably. He had been watching the entire scene unfold from the jump seat a few rows away. His hands fidgeted with the edge of a service napkin, unsure if he should step in. Damon finally stood. He did so without hurry, unfolding his tall frame with deliberate composure. The seatbelt clicked open with a soft, metallic snap. Trevor instinctively took a step back, unsettled not by Damon's size, but by the aura of power that followed him like a shadow. "I've watched you for the last 45 minutes, Mr. Knox," Damon began, his voice even, measured. "You've laughed at my son, mocked his clothing, whispered about him to other passengers, and now you've nearly scalded him." Trevor's eyes narrowed. "Your son?" "Yes," Damon confirmed. "My son." Caden Marin recognition didn't strike Trevor immediately, but it flickered behind his eyes, like a fuse trying to light. "He's just a kid," Trevor muttered defensively. "Wearing a suit. Playing pretend. He's more than that," Damon said, stepping forward. "He's respectful. He's composed. And, unlike you, he understands that dignity isn't something you earn with seniority. It's something you uphold, regardless of the uniform you wear. Passengers leaned in now, not for gossip, but from a quiet understanding that something significant was happening. Even the flight's hum seemed to lower, as if the plane itself held its breath. "I suggest you take a break, Mr. Knox," Damon continued, "before your behavior causes more damage than turbulence ever could." Trevor opened his mouth, but no words came. His authority, so absolute minutes ago, had vanished, replaced by something far more humbling. Felix finally rose from his seat and approached quietly. "I'll take over from here," he said, not waiting for Trevor's response. The words were spoken with quiet courage. A decision had been made. Trevor's shoulders stiffened. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly toward the galley, tray clattering as it landed on the metal counter. The curtain swished closed behind him. Damon turned to Caden, crouched beside him, and checked the boy's sleeve for any burn. Caden shook his head. He was unharmed, physically. But something inside him had changed. Not broken. Hardened. "I'm okay," Caden whispered. Damon nodded, then reached up and pressed the call button again, this time for the captain. It was no longer about spilled coffee, or a bad joke. It was about what came next. When patience ends, truth begins to rise. Trevor approached Damon's seat with a stiff smile that barely reached his eyes. His tone was hollow, rehearsed, polite only in surface form, not in spirit. "Yes, sir," he said, his voice tight with restrained annoyance. Damon looked up from where he sat beside his son, his expression calm, yet with a weight behind his gaze that could not be ignored. He gestured toward Caden, who sat stiffly by the window, hands clasped tightly over the small leather briefcase resting on his lap. The boy's eyes were lowered, his face composed but pale. "My child was just humiliated in front of passengers," Damon said evenly. "Would you care to explain why?" Trevor gave a soft chuckle, almost dismissive as he shifted his weight to one side. His arms folded loosely, the tray in his hand resting awkwardly against his hip. "Humiliated?" he repeated as if the word amused him. "Sir, I was only trying to lighten the mood. It's just, well, not every day you see a child pretending to be a CEO." The moment hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. A few heads turned. Conversation died down around them. The laughter that had earlier echoed faintly from the other seats now vanished. Damon's eyes did not leave Trevor's face. The calm in his tone remained, but it was now underscored with something colder. "Pretending?" he asked, each syllable delivered with quiet precision. Trevor shrugged casually, as if brushing off dust. "It's a plane, not a boardroom," he said, chuckling again. "We can't have children disrupting the tone of the cabin." Caden flinched just slightly. Damon noticed. The rows around them grew still. A businessman in the row ahead subtly removed his headphones. An older gentleman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Even the sound of the engines felt distant now, muffled beneath the building pressure in the cabin. Damon leaned forward slightly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I see," he said. "And you believe professionalism belongs only to adults?" Trevor, still unaware of the storm he was summoning, smiled smugly. "I believe first class is for those who've earned it." There it was, the line he had repeated in his head a dozen times, a punch he thought would land. But instead of triumph, silence met his words, thick and absolute. Damon didn't answer right away. He studied Trevor's face with the quiet intensity of a man who had seen many masks fall. Then, without a word, he reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. The motion was fluid, unhurried, yet deliberate. From within, he pulled a sleek, silver-edged identification badge. The Skyreach insignia gleamed in the cabin light, bold, unmistakable. Beneath it, engraved in clear lettering, was the name: Damon Marin, Chief Executive Officer, Skyreach Airways. Trevor blinked. For a moment he didn't move. His smirk faltered, then collapsed entirely. His gaze darted from the badge to Damon's face, then back again. "You," he stammered, voice cracking slightly. "You're Mr. Marin?" Damon's tone remained cool, but the shift in atmosphere was seismic. A murmur rippled across the cabin. Passengers exchanged stunned glances. Felix, the younger attendant who had been silently stocking the beverage cart a few rows down, froze with a carton of cream in hand. "Yes," Damon said quietly, "and this child pretending to be a CEO is my son." Trevor's lips parted, but no words came out. The blood drained from his face. He took a step back, suddenly aware of how small the aisle had become. I didn't mean offense," he sputtered. "I was only joking." "I didn't realize." Damon's eyes narrowed slightly. "A joke," he said, "reveals more about its teller than its target." The nearby passengers remained silent, absorbed. Even the hum of the engine seemed to hush in respect. Trevor opened his mouth again, perhaps to defend himself, perhaps to retreat, but the sound of firm footsteps interrupted him. The captain had entered the cabin, alerted by a discreet signal from a crew member who had overheard the rising tension. His presence only deepened the gravity of the moment. He recognized Damon immediately and straightened instinctively. "Mr. Marin," the captain said, voice low but clear, "is everything all right here?" Damon didn't turn to him right away. He kept his eyes on Trevor, who now stood with his hands nervously fidgeting at his sides. "Kindly reassign Mr. Knox's duties for the remainder of the flight," Damon said, his voice now carrying just enough volume to ensure the nearby rows heard every word. "He'll sit as a passenger." There was no fury in his tone, no raised voice, but the authority in it struck harder than any shout. The captain nodded, already understanding. "Yes, sir." Trevor's shoulders sagged. His mouth tightened as if to argue, but the words never came. He turned slowly and walked toward the back of the cabin, past passengers whose eyes he no longer had the courage to meet. His polished shoes made no sound on the carpeted aisle, but his shame echoed louder than footsteps ever could. Damon sat down beside his son once more, the badge still resting in his hand. Caden glanced at him, not with triumph, but with awe. And in the wake of the confrontation, something had shifted. Where once there was mockery, now there was reverence. Where once a child had been laughed at, now silence honored him. Damon placed the badge back into his jacket, adjusted his son's seatbelt gently, and spoke no more. "Then allow me to reintroduce you to who earned this seat." For a full second, Trevor Knox stood frozen, the polished identification badge in Damon Marin's hand gleaming like a verdict. The quiet hum of the aircraft's engines seemed to vanish under the sudden stillness that gripped the cabin. Passengers who had once smirked at Trevor's jokes now leaned forward in their plush seats, their expressions shifting from amusement to intrigue. Trevor's smirk faltered as his eyes scanned the silver crest of the Skyreach logo, then the bold print beneath it, Damon R. Marin, CEO. His face, once flushed with smug superiority, now drained of all color. You're Mr. Marin?" he stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of realization. Damon didn't move. His stance remained composed, shoulders relaxed, his hand still holding the badge with effortless calm. "Yes," he said, his tone quiet but firm, like the stillness before a storm. "And this child pretending to be a CEO," he paused, glancing briefly at Caden, "is my son." The cabin shifted with sudden energy. Whispered murmurs rippled through the aisle like a current. Passengers who had only moments ago chuckled at Trevor's sarcasm now exchanged startled looks. Felix, the younger attendant, stood a few rows back, eyes wide, lips parted as if trying to form a sentence but failing. Trevor took a small step back. His hands twitched at his sides, unsure whether to fold or clasp them, his composure slipping fast. "Sir, I didn't mean any offense," he began, the words spilling out in panicked fragments. "It was just a joke. I didn't." Damon cut him off with a slight shake of the head. Not harsh, not loud, just final. A joke, he said, reveals more about its teller than its target. Trevor's mouth hung open, but no answer came. His face betrayed the internal struggle between defense and surrender. Sweat beaded at his brow despite the steady climate of the cabin. He looked down, avoiding eye contact as if the carpeted floor might swallow his mistake. Then footsteps approached. The captain, a tall, salt-haired man with squared shoulders and a composed air, stepped out from behind the cockpit door. His eyes met Damon's, and in that instant, recognition bloomed across his face. He straightened subtly, a flicker of concern crossing his otherwise neutral expression. "Mr. Marin," the captain said respectfully, nodding once, "is there a problem?" Trevor turned toward him as if for rescue, but Damon spoke first, his words controlled, deliberate, and audible enough to reach the nearby rows without ever raising his voice. "Yes, kindly reassign Mr. Knox's duties for the remainder of the flight. He'll sit as a passenger." The words struck like a gavel. The captain blinked, then gave a short nod. Understood. No hesitation, no questions. He turned to Trevor with the same authority he used to issue landing clearances. "You're relieved of service. Take seat 24A in the rear cabin." Now Trevor's jaw moved wordlessly before he gave a stiff nod and backed away. Each step he took down the aisle echoed in silence. Passengers stared, some in pity, others in quiet satisfaction. His earlier swagger had dissolved into something smaller, frailer. He passed Felix without a word, and the younger attendant shifted awkwardly aside. Caden, still seated by the window, watched it all unfold with a mixture of confusion and awe. He wasn't sure what to feel, vindicated, embarrassed, or both. Damon took a breath, then calmly tucked the badge back into his coat pocket and returned to his seat beside his son. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caden turned slowly. "Was that too much?" he asked softly. Damon looked at him, eyes warm but resolute. "No, son," he said. "It was just enough." Behind them, the sound of the cabin returned. Passengers shifted, seatbelts clicked. A man in business attire gave Damon a subtle nod of approval. Another leaned toward his wife and whispered something that ended in a glance toward Caden. Felix approached cautiously a few minutes later, offering bottled water with trembling hands. "Mr. Marin," he began, I didn't know." "I should have stepped in sooner." Damon regarded him evenly. "Then learn from it," he said. "That's what decent men do." Felix swallowed and nodded, grateful for the second chance Trevor had thrown away. The rest of the flight continued in respectful quiet. But something had changed in the atmosphere. Not fear, but recognition. The man they had mistaken for just another passenger had reminded them that real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't humiliate. It doesn't gloat. It acts precisely, calmly, and with weight. Power spoken softly can still echo like thunder. Trevor sat in the last row of the aircraft, arms folded tightly across his chest, eyes fixed on the back of the seat in front of him. His breath came in shallow, angry bursts, but it wasn't anger at anyone else, not truly. It was the burning, inescapable sting of shame that clung to him like sweat. The coffee incident, the call button, Damon's calm reveal, all of it had unraveled in front of dozens of first-class passengers. His smirk had vanished the moment Damon Marin revealed the name behind the badge. CEO, Skyreach, the very man whose son he'd mocked. Trevor had tried to maintain control, but it slipped through his fingers like sand in a storm. And now, silence was his only companion, and it was deafening. In the front cabin, the mood had shifted. Where there had once been quiet chuckles and amused glances, now sat a hush of unease and self-reflection. The passengers, who had earlier smirked at Trevor's snide jokes, now avoided looking at the boy in the Navy suit, the same boy they'd dismissed as a novelty. Caden Marin. The soft chime of the overhead lights brought attention to a lone figure moving toward Caden's seat. Felix, the younger flight attendant, approached hesitantly. Each step weighed with guilt. His crisp uniform now felt like a burden, his role a contradiction to the silence in the cabin. His hands were clenched slightly, unsure whether to straighten his tie or wring his fingers. He stopped beside Caden's seat and knelt slightly to match the boy's eye level. His voice was low, respectful, and carried the weight of regret. "I should have stopped him earlier," he said, avoiding the gaze of Damon seated beside the boy. "I knew it was wrong, but I didn't say anything." Caden turned to him slowly. The redness in his eyes had faded, replaced by something older, something not often seen in 11-year-olds. He offered a faint smile, the kind that was meant to put others at ease even when it cost something to give. "It's okay," Caden said gently, his voice calm but steady. "My dad says people show who they are when they think no one important is watching." Felix froze. The words landed with the weight of a quiet truth. He nodded slowly, lowering his head in shame. "He was wrong to treat you that way," Felix murmured. "I was wrong to let it happen." Damon remained silent beside his son, watching. There was no need to speak. His presence alone kept the tension anchored. He had chosen not to escalate further, not because he lacked the power, but because power didn't always mean spectacle. Sometimes restraint said more than retaliation. From across the aisle, a man who had chuckled earlier shifted in his seat, now clearly uncomfortable. Another passenger, who had whispered about miniature CEOS, cleared his throat and looked away. The mood had changed. Respect had replaced mockery, not because someone demanded it, but because it had been earned. Caden glanced down at his briefcase, the one with the initials KM engraved in gold. He traced the letters softly with his thumb, his thoughts swimming. The words Trevor had thrown at him still echoed, but they no longer pierced. They merely floated. He had survived worse days. What lingered was not the pain, but the lesson. Beside him, Damon leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet, fatherly. "You handled that better than most grown men would have." Caden turned toward him, lips parting just slightly. "I just remembered what you told me," he said, his voice still low. "Some people only laugh to hide how small they feel." Damon smiled, proud, not loud. He reached out and gently tapped his son's shoulder, nodding. "Exactly," he whispered. "And now the smallness shows." The plane continued its path through the clouds, engines humming like a steady heartbeat. In that moment, everything felt still. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting soft shadows across the aisle. Trevor sat far behind, out of view, but his absence loomed heavier than his presence ever had. He had been silenced not by force, but by truth. Passengers who had once smirked now stole glances at the boy by the window, not with judgment, but with recognition. The suit, the tie clip, the polished shoes, they weren't just ornaments now. They were symbols of quiet dignity, of a boy who had refused to fall into bitterness, of a father who had taught restraint when revenge was easier. Felix returned to the galley, his steps slower but lighter, as if he'd been allowed a second chance. Caden looked out the window again, eyes watching the clouds drift below like soft whispers of the world. There was no announcement, no applause, no spotlight. But in that quiet cabin, something had shifted. An understanding had taken root. Truth doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers through grace. The cockpit door sealed shut behind the captain as he picked up the discreet line to Skyreach operations. His voice, though steady, carried undertones of concern. "Executive incident aboard Flight 827. Recommend logging and escalation under Code Blue protocol. Passenger is Damon Marin." A brief silence followed, then a clipped acknowledgement crackled through the line. "Copy that. Monitoring initiated." While the captain returned to his seat, The cabin behind him had shifted into an uneasy calm. Passengers whispered, some eyes darting toward the front where the confrontation had unfolded. Others kept to themselves, pretending to read or sleep. But the atmosphere was no longer serene. It was charged, as though the aircraft itself held its breath. Further back, Trevor Knox sat stiffly on a fold-down jump seat near the galley, his fingers twitching. His cheeks still burned with humiliation, but beneath the shame, a more dangerous emotion churned: resentment. He clenched and unclenched his jaw, staring blankly at the tray cart beside him as the memory of Damon Marin's calm voice replayed in his mind. "Then allow me to reintroduce you to who earned this seat." The words struck like a branding iron: quiet, devastating, irreversible. Trevor's face twisted. He had been reduced to a joke in front of passengers, in front of Felix, in front of a boy wearing a suit. He had devoted a decade of his life to this airline, taking every red-eye shift, every holiday schedule, enduring turbulence, complaints, and impossible standards. And for what? To be publicly stripped of authority by a child's father who happened to own the skies he worked in? His pride cracked under the weight of that thought. With sudden force, he pulled his tablet from his carry case, tapping the screen awake. The low light from the display cast a pale glow on his face, revealing eyes no longer brimming with shame but simmering with something colder: calculation. He opened a secured messaging app he hadn't used in weeks. At the top of the message list sat a name: AG, Horizon Liaison. Trevor hesitated only a moment before clicking into the draft box. His fingers hovered, then began typing in jagged bursts. "You wanted leverage on Skyreach? I can give you something worth their silence." He paused, breathing hard. The sentence stared back at him, pulsing faintly in the dim light. He didn't hit send. Not yet. But he did press save, just in case. The draft disappeared into the cloud, syncing to his account. Trevor shut off the tablet and tucked it back under the jump seat. He leaned forward, cradling his head in his hands, but the anger hadn't lessened. It had merely changed shape. His career felt like a shrinking tunnel, and this was the only exit he could see. Footsteps approached. He looked up to find Felix standing awkwardly at the edge of the galley, eyes hesitant. The younger attendant spoke quietly. "Trevor, are you all right?" Trevor's voice came out hoarse. "You think being perfect keeps you safe here?" Felix's brows pulled together. "I didn't mean..." But Trevor was already waving him off with a cold, sharp gesture. "Just remember, kid. Stars don't stay in one sky forever. They fall, and when they do, it's the quiet ones that watch where they land." Felix said nothing more. He stepped back slowly, concern etched across his face. He glanced once toward the front of the cabin, then disappeared down the aisle. Trevor remained where he was, shoulders hunched, the glow of the overhead light making the sweat on his forehead glisten. His thoughts spun. If Horizon responded, if they made an offer, he could still land on his feet. He could be respected again, even if it meant stepping over the edge. Up front, the plane remained steady, the engines humming with artificial calm. But somewhere between 30,000 feet and the clouds below, something unseen had shifted. The moment of disgrace wasn't over. It had only just begun to ripple outward. And far beneath the polished uniforms and gleaming cabin lights, beneath the paper-thin pleasantries and whispered apologies, a different kind of turbulence had been born, one that no captain could steer away from. Sometimes disgrace doesn't end with shame. It begins its revenge quietly. The wheels of Flight 827 touched down on the shimmering tarmac of Ardent City under a sky streaked with copper and gold. The descent had been smooth, but for Damon Marin, the real turbulence was just beginning. The moment the aircraft came to a halt at the private terminal gate, a trio of Skyreach ground staff stood waiting in silent formation, each man wearing a black earpiece and a badge clipped neatly to their jackets. Leading them was Lewis Crane, the operations manager, whose sharp eyes scanned the cabin even before the aircraft doors hissed open. Damon stood calmly, his posture composed, his expression unreadable. To the passengers, he remained just another executive. But behind his steady gaze, his mind was racing with questions. He had witnessed enough aboard the flight to know Trevor Knox's behavior wasn't just poor conduct. It was something deeper, something calculated. "Mr. Marin," Lewis greeted quietly, stepping aside to let Damon and his son descend the stairway into the terminal's sleek glass corridor. Caden walked beside his father, clutching his small briefcase, unaware of the full gravity unfolding around him. Damon offered a nod. "Keep this internal for now," he said in a low tone, the edge of steel in his voice. "Let's see what integrity looks like when it's tested." Inside the terminal, the silence was sharper than any reprimand. Trevor Knox had been quietly removed from the plane moments after the other passengers disembarked. Now he sat alone in a stark conference room, flanked by two members of Skyreach's security division. His uniform, once crisp and self-assured, looked out of place now, like a costume worn too long. His face was pale. The sarcasm that once animated him had drained completely. "I didn't do anything criminal," Trevor muttered, his fingers drumming the edge of the table, knuckles whitening with each tap. "I just made a joke." "Then you'll have no problem answering a few formal questions," replied one of the guards evenly. Meanwhile, in the upper floor of the executive wing, Damon had stepped into his office, a glass-paneled room that overlooked both the runway and the control tower beyond. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. He dropped his travel bag beside the leather chair and turned toward the terminal monitor mounted on the wall. The ping came less than a minute later. "Alert! Unauthorized communication flagged. Flight 827, crew terminal." His brow furrowed. He tapped into the secure admin console with swift familiarity. The message was brief, but it chilled him. "You wanted leverage on Skyreach? I can give you something worth their silence." It was unsent. But that didn't matter. The autosync logs revealed that Trevor's personal tablet had been connected to Skyreach's onboard crew terminal. The message draft had been captured by the company's cybersecurity system the moment it was saved. The timestamp matched a period shortly after the coffee spill incident. Damon read the line again, slower this time. His stomach turned, not in fear, but in recognition. This wasn't a joke. It wasn't just bitterness from a disgruntled employee. It was a signal, and Damon understood signals better than most. He turned sharply, picking up the secure line to the internal security office. "Mason Ryle," he said. "Now." Within minutes, Mason, tall, broad-shouldered, always dressed in dark suits, entered with his usual quiet urgency. A former intelligence officer with an uncanny gift for reading between the lines, Mason didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's the priority?" he asked, stepping to Damon's desk. Damon turned the monitor toward him. "Flight 827, cabin crew. Read it." Mason scanned the flagged message and then the accompanying metadata. Device ID. Time of sync. Location tag. His eyes narrowed. "This was no accident," he muttered. "Looks like Knox was lining up a deal with someone off-grid." "A rival," Damon said. "Likely Horizon Air. He's been bitter, yes. But this? This isn't bitterness. This is compromise." Mason nodded slowly. He underestimated who he was mocking. A beat of silence passed as both men stared at the screen. Beyond the office glass, the terminal lights flickered on as the evening sky dimmed. "Start a full scan," Damon ordered. "Every terminal sync from that flight. Check for outbound pings to unauthorized IPS, and flag any crew member who's had contact with external recruiters in the last 6 months." "Understood," Mason said. He was already dialing in the task force before he left the room. Back downstairs, Trevor had begun pacing, agitated and confused. He didn't know about the flag. He thought he had deleted the draft. It wasn't even sent. How could it matter? He spun toward the mirrored window and muttered, This isn't how it's supposed to go." The mirrored glass didn't respond, but behind it, Damon stood silently, watching him, not gloating, calculating. This wasn't just about his son anymore. The insult had opened a door, one that revealed rot behind the luxury. Outside, the night settled over Ardent City. Aircraft lights blinked rhythmically in the distance. Inside, Skyreach's heart beat faster. Something had been uncovered, and it had started with a spilled cup of coffee and a cruel remark. Damon's hand rested on the edge of the glass, eyes still fixed on Trevor's pacing figure. The humiliation of a child had been a spark, but what it lit was far more dangerous. Fate sometimes hides warnings inside humiliation, waiting for the right eyes to see. The flight attendant ridiculed the black teen's luxury outfit, sneering that he was pretending to be rich, unaware the boy's father owned the very airline he worked for. If you believe every act of disrespect must be answered, hit subscribe now. Justice starts here. The message flickered on the edge of the screen like a pulse, its implications growing louder with each passing second. Damon Marin sat still in his chair, the glass walls of his office casting reflections of city lights that danced like fireflies across the polished floor. The office was silent, too silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the computer cooling fan and the distant throb of aircraft engines beyond the executive tower. But inside Damon's mind, a storm was already gathering. He scrolled again. The flagged communication from Flight 827's onboard tablet had triggered a silent alert in Skyreach's cybersecurity system, protocol for any breach attempt. At first, it appeared minor, an unsent draft from a crew device caught in an automated sweep. But what chilled Damon was the content. Fragments of leaked information had been bundled carelessly into the unsent message. Coded references to crew scheduling rotations, data hints that suggested access to VIP passenger logs, even phrases that matched the naming convention of Skyreach's upcoming luxury expansion, Project Havenwing, still under wraps and restricted to a classified circle of executives. None of this should have ever been on a flight attendant's device. Damon leaned back slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen. The betrayal stung, but it was the timing that rattled him. He would never have known this message existed if not for Trevor Knox's petty mockery of Caden. That single moment of cruelty, meant only to humiliate a child, had accidentally revealed a thread, and now Damon saw how deep it might run. Without hesitation, he reached for the intercom panel on his desk and pressed a secure line. "Get Mason up here." "Now," he said, his voice low but firm. Within minutes, Mason Ryle stepped into the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair and the posture of a man who still moved like he was in the field, Mason carried his experience like armor. As Skyreach's head of security and a former intelligence operative, he knew how to read danger before it shouted. "What's going on?" Mason asked, closing the door behind him. Damon turned the monitor slightly toward him. This message was caught by our cyber monitors. Originated from Flight 827, Trevor Knox's assigned device. Mason stepped closer, scanning the contents. His brow furrowed. Crew assignments, manifest patterns, even flight route prototypes. He tapped the screen once, then again. Some of these data points line up with our protected files. Damon nodded slowly, the tension in his jaw visible. He didn't send it. But the file was saved, and the system synced it automatically. The intent is there. "Do we know if anyone else accessed it?" Mason asked, his tone sharper now. "Not yet." "But it's not the first time we've seen anomalies in our internal logs," Damon replied. "This just confirmed it wasn't a glitch. Someone's been leaking information. And Trevor's tablet just lit the fuse." Mason straightened, his expression growing grim. "This looks deliberate," he said. "If your name hadn't come up during the incident with your son, this would have stayed buried in the noise." Damon stood, walking to the glass wall. He looked out at the hangars below, where the latest Skyreach aircraft sat under floodlights like sleeping giants. "I keep wondering," he said quietly, "was Trevor just careless, or is he part of something bigger?" The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only when Mason crossed to Damon's side. "We'll start with his communications history," Mason said. "Backtrack every device he's logged into, who he's emailed, who he's met. If this is a pattern, we'll see it." Damon turned toward him, eyes sharp. "Start tonight. Pull the encrypted archives. Don't go through regular channels. Keep it between us until we know how wide this runs." Mason gave a short nod. "Understood." Damon returned to his desk, tapping on the keyboard, opening deeper logs from the IT security sweep. His fingers moved fast, his mind faster. With each line of metadata, his instincts sharpened. There were timestamps, messages written late at night, odd login IPs rerouted through masking networks. One sequence repeated, a batch of logins pinging from an internal terminal during red-eye flights, just when the corporate systems were least active. Damon's eyes narrowed. Who else had access at those hours? Who had something to gain? A tremor of something deeper crept in. Not just anger or betrayal, but realization. Someone had been feeding Skyreach's internal data to an outsider, and the breach might have begun months ago. Trevor's smug smirk, his need to tear others down, it had drawn attention. But it wasn't just bad behavior. It was a crack in the wall. And now that crack had revealed rot. Damon reached for his phone, but paused. A knock sounded at the door. It was Mason again, returning with a portable drive in hand. "This is the full server archive from the past 6 months. I pulled it manually from the security vault," he said. "There's something else." "Our system flagged Trevor's user profile last month for abnormal sync behavior. It was overridden." "By who?" Damon asked sharply. "I'm still tracing that," Mason said, "but the override didn't come from him." "That suggests someone higher." Damon exhaled slowly, steadying the storm brewing inside him. He stared at the screen again, the digital fragments glowing like embers. His company had been compromised. Not by force, but by whispers, by weakness, by trust misused. The incident with Caden had felt like a personal insult, but now he saw it as something more. It was a warning, and Damon Marin didn't ignore warnings. He glanced once more at the text from Trevor's tablet, then closed the file. "Sometimes," Damon murmured, "a storm breaks to reveal the rot beneath the clouds." Trevor's hands trembled as he paced the narrow confines of the employee dormitory's holding room, the muted hum of fluorescent lights buzzing above him like a swarm of unseen wasps. The plain, beige walls, once familiar and dull, now felt like they were closing in. A security camera in the corner followed his every movement. He kept darting glances at it, breathing heavily, the air thick with anxiety and shame. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as if guilt itself had taken root in his limbs. He ran a hand through his damp hair, sweat beading across his forehead. How had it come to this? One sarcastic remark, one smirk, one joke. That's all it was supposed to be. And yet now he was under investigation, locked away like a criminal, facing questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The weight of what he had done, or almost done, pressed on him like the ceiling might crack open and drop. The door clicked open. Trevor stopped mid-step, heart pounding. Standing in the doorway was Mason Ryle, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm, unreadable expression. His eyes, however, were sharp, scanning Trevor like a man who had already pieced the puzzle together before asking a single question. Mason entered without a word, setting a digital tablet on the metal table in the center of the room. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He simply turned the tablet so Trevor could see the screen. A few lines of text glowed softly in the dim light. Trevor stared at it. His stomach dropped. "I didn't send anything," Trevor said quickly, his voice cracking. "I swear, I never sent it." Mason tilted his head slightly, arms folded across his chest. "You didn't send it," he repeated slowly with an edge of finality. "But you wrote it." The system auto-synced before you saved. Trevor felt the blood drain from his face. "What? That's not possible. I just typed something. It was nothing. Just words. I didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to?" Mason interrupted softly, leaning forward. "You typed a message offering confidential Skyreach data to a competitor. Whether you hit send or not doesn't change the fact that it's recorded. And it didn't come from your personal phone, Trevor. It came from your crew-issued tablet. Logged in, synced, and flagged." Trevor's knees buckled slightly. He dropped into the chair behind him without thinking, as if his body gave up before his mind could catch up. "I didn't think they were serious," he whispered. "It was just talk. The guy from Horizon, he messaged me months ago. Said I deserved better. Said they were watching me." Mason remained silent. Trevor looked up, eyes glassy. "He told me they were expanding. That they needed people who understood the industry. He said nobody at Skyreach would ever see what I was worth. So you decided to prove him right?" Mason's voice didn't rise, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "By selling out your team? Your company?" Trevor shook his head furiously. "It wasn't like that. I was frustrated. Yeah, I've been working flights for 10 years. Never got promoted past senior attendant. New guys come in, get fast-tracked. I figured if someone was finally offering me a shot—" "You figured it wouldn't matter," Mason said, finishing the sentence for him. Trevor blinked, defeated. "I was angry," he admitted after a long pause. "And then the kid, he shows up in that suit, sitting in first class like he owns the place. I didn't know who he was. I just saw another rich brat trying to play grown-up, and he stopped, the shame choking him. "You mocked a child," Mason said bluntly, "then nearly handed corporate secrets to a rival. You're lucky you're sitting in this room, not a courtroom." Trevor lowered his head into his hands. The silence stretched. "I didn't think it would spiral," he muttered. "They never do," Mason replied. He tapped the tablet, locking it, then stepped back toward the door. "You'll remain here until HR and legal complete their review. You'll be notified when a formal disciplinary hearing is scheduled. Until then, no contact with outside parties. And I suggest you don't try to delete anything. The system already has a record." Trevor nodded weakly, unable to look up. Outside the room, separated by one-way glass, Damon Marin stood watching. He hadn't spoken a word during the interrogation, but he had heard every syllable. His jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the broken figure of the man who had dared to belittle his son and jeopardize his company in a single breath. He wasn't just furious. He was disappointed, deeply, completely disappointed. Trevor Knox wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't some villain in a boardroom. He was a man who let envy rot him from the inside, and when the cracks showed, they didn't leak remorse. They leaked destruction. And yet, as Damon stared at him, something unexpected stirred. Pity. For a man who had climbed only to tear down others. For a man who had mistaken opportunity for entitlement. For a man who, in trying to be seen, had disappeared into disgrace. Behind the glass, Trevor slumped farther into the chair, alone with his thoughts and the consequences now catching up. Pride rarely ends where it starts. It always falls harder than it rose. Caden Marin sat quietly in the corner of the executive lounge, his feet barely reaching the floor as they dangled from the plush leather seat. The glass walls surrounding him shimmered with the golden light of late afternoon, casting long shadows that danced across the marble floor. Men in dark suits moved briskly past, their voices hushed but urgent, eyes locked on phones or folders. The air pulsed with tension. Something was happening, something big. His gaze followed them, a frown creasing his smooth brow. Though no one spoke directly to him, he could feel the energy shift, the way eyes flicked past him without truly seeing, the way conversation dipped when he glanced up. He clutched the armrests, his small fingers tense, trying to understand what part he played in the storm quietly forming around him. The sliding doors whispered open behind him. He didn't need to turn. He knew the rhythm of those footsteps. Damon Marin walked with quiet certainty, his tailored suit unassuming yet refined, the weight of decision already upon his shoulders. He paused only a moment before sitting beside his son, his presence grounding the room in a sudden hush. For a while, they sat in silence, just watching the blur of movement outside the glass. Caden didn't look at his father when he asked the question. His voice was barely louder than a breath. "Dad, did that man lose his job because of me?" Damon didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the executives filing past like chess pieces being moved across an unseen board. Then he shook his head gently, voice low but firm. "No, son. He lost it because he forgot his values." Damon turned slightly, meeting his son's gaze. "You just reminded me to look closer." Caden swallowed. The explanation was clear, but the weight behind it wasn't so easy to carry. He hesitated, then said, "He said I didn't belong there." The words dropped like stones into a still pond. Damon's jaw tensed, and for a moment his eyes darkened, not with rage, but with something colder. Disappointment. Not in his son. Never that. But in the world that forced a child to question his place. Damon turned his head toward the glass wall, staring not at the room, but at their reflection. The image of a boy and a man, side by side, both shaped by the moment. "People like him," Damon said slowly, "see status as walls. But real class, Caden, is how you treat people when you think no one can stop you." Caden's shoulders relaxed slightly. The lesson struck deep, not just as a response, but as a belief. He didn't speak, but the quiet way he nodded showed he was trying to understand, not just with his mind, but with his heart. Outside, Mason Ryle appeared briefly in the hallway, head of security, sharp-eyed and unflinching. He passed a folder to another executive who paled as he flipped through it. Whatever was inside carried weight. Damon watched them, but didn't rise. Not yet. There were always battles, always fires to put out. But this moment, this stillness between father and son, was the one that mattered most. Caden fidgeted, glancing again toward the hallway. "Are we in trouble?" he asked. "No," Damon said, and for the first time in hours he smiled faintly. "We're in motion." "That's different." Caden tilted his head, curious. Damon leaned back in his seat, his voice soft but steady. "The man who mocked you was part of something bigger. We're learning what that is. But don't ever think it started with you." "But it changed because of me," Caden said, his eyes searching. Damon looked at his son with pride, tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. "Yes," he said quietly, "because of how you stood when others laughed. You reminded me not to look away." There was a pause. The voices outside were growing louder now, tense arguments and firm commands masked as polite conversation. Caden leaned against his father's side, his head just beneath Damon's shoulder. For a moment, Damon rested his hand gently on the boy's back. He didn't tell Caden about the message that had triggered a cyber alert, or the leak that hinted at a deeper betrayal, or the name that had resurfaced from Skyreach's past. Those truths would come soon enough. For now, what mattered was this. The boy who had been mocked wasn't broken. He was growing. Outside the lounge, the storm continued to brew. Executives gathered, whispers turned into orders, and Mason's stride quickened. But within the quiet, glass-encased room, a boy's pain was slowly being reshaped into strength. And beside him sat a man who had learned, once again, that dignity is often revealed through the smallest voices. Damon stood, smoothing the front of his jacket. He looked down at Caden, who remained seated, eyes thoughtful. "You ready to keep going?" Damon asked. Caden nodded. "Always." Damon offered a hand. Caden took it, and as they walked toward the doors, away from the safety of the lounge and into the eye of the storm, Damon said just loud enough for his son to hear, "Some lessons arrive wearing pain, but they leave carrying purpose." Damon Marin stood at the head of the long, polished table in the Skyreach executive boardroom, his arms folded and his face unreadable. Around him, the room buzzed with quiet tension. The walls of glass revealed a night-lit Ardent City skyline beyond, glittering with promise, but inside the room, shadows lingered. The air was heavy with unspoken questions. He had just finished presenting the latest findings. Trevor Knox was not an isolated case. The cybersecurity audit revealed connections between 3 additional crew members and Horizon Air's covert recruiting network. All 3 had received encrypted messages from the same unidentified source, a digital trail that led back to a private server registered under a shell company. It was more than coincidence. It was a web. "We can't treat this as just an internal scandal," Damon said, his voice calm but edged with iron. "It's an infection." A murmur rippled through the boardroom. Some nodded, others exchanged wary glances. The idea that betrayal had quietly festered within Skyreach's own ranks unsettled even the most seasoned executives. Damon let the silence stretch. He wanted them to sit with the weight of it. Mason Ryle, seated to Damon's right, leaned forward. "We need a full internal audit. Not just digital, personnel, hiring histories, transfer records. If Horizon is placing people intentionally, this goes deeper than we thought." Damon didn't hesitate. Approved. Effective immediately, the decision passed like a stone into still water, sending visible ripples across the room. Department heads began scribbling notes, murmuring into headsets, alerting their teams to prepare for a long night. Damon turned and exited the room without another word. He needed a moment away from the endless analysis, the polite panic. As the heavy doors closed behind him, his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He paused in the hallway, the buzz like a distant warning bell. He retrieved the device and saw a name that pulled him back into the moment. Felix Orlin. The young attendant had been quiet since his commendation, respectful of Damon's request to let the matter rest. But now he was reaching out again, breaking silence only because something was too important to ignore. Damon opened the message. "Sir, I know you said not to intervene further, but I found a hidden note Trevor left in the galley compartment. It mentioned someone named Carter Vale." The name hit him like a slap. Carter Vale. Damon's breath caught. His hand lowered the phone slowly, but his mind was already spiraling. That name hadn't been spoken in this building for over a year. Carter had once sat at this very table, a sharp, ambitious executive with a reputation for brilliance and an unsettling hunger for recognition. His departure had been sudden, disguised as a strategic realignment. But Damon had always suspected something more. Carter hadn't just left Skyreach, he'd vanished from the corporate radar entirely. Until now. Damon turned back toward the boardroom but paused. He didn't want to raise the alarm. Not yet. Not until he knew what this meant. He dialed Mason directly. "Come to my office." Now within minutes, Mason entered the sleek corner room, where low lights reflected off glass shelves lined with aviation trophies and prototype models. Damon handed him the phone without a word. Mason read the message, his eyes narrowing. "Vale," Mason muttered. "That name's been cold for months." "Not anymore," Damon said, his voice low. Mason took a breath, then crossed to Damon's desk and pulled out his tablet. If Trevor referenced him, and if it was in a handwritten note, it means Carter isn't just watching, he's orchestrating. Damon nodded slowly. This isn't about one angry employee venting in a galley. It's about leverage, planning, timing, which makes Vale the architect, Mason said. The pieces were starting to move. Trevor had been arrogant, yes, but not clever enough to initiate corporate infiltration. He was a pawn, a mouthpiece. But someone had to be setting the board. What if Trevor's behavior on the flight wasn't just about ego? Damon murmured, pacing now. What if it was designed to trigger something, to bait a response from me? Mason frowned. You think Carter knew you'd be on that flight? I think Carter knows a lot more than we do, Damon replied. The implications were chilling. Vale's strategy wasn't about data leaks alone. It was psychological, personal, precise. Suddenly, Damon's thoughts turned to Caden, the memory of his son's quiet composure under pressure, the insult that started all this, a humiliation that had revealed not just bad behavior, but a carefully hidden rot within their walls. He stopped pacing and turned to Mason. I want everything we have on Carter Vale. Personal records, exit interviews, non-disclosure clauses, and I want to know exactly where he went after he left. I'll need 2 hours, Mason said. You have one, Damon replied. Mason left, already typing as he walked. Damon stood alone in the dim light of his office, watching the city glow beyond the glass. It was never just about a flight. It never was. The real turbulence always started after the wheels hit the ground. The phone buzzed again, this time, a system alert from the internal audit team. More anomalies, more names. Damon didn't look away from the skyline. Beneath one insult lay a conspiracy waiting to be unmasked. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Damon Marin stepped out onto the top floor of Horizon Air's executive tower, his expression unreadable, his stride calm but deliberate. Behind him, Mason Ryle followed, carrying a thin black briefcase with Skyreach's crest engraved on its lock. The glass-paneled corridor ahead was flooded with morning light, casting long shadows across the marble floor. It was a beautiful day in Ardent City, the kind of day meant for new beginnings, but Damon had come to end something. At the far end of the corridor, glass doors opened into a sleek, modern boardroom. Horizon's CEO, Leonard Vance, rose with a diplomatic smile, offering a handshake. Damon, he said warmly, a pleasure, as always. I wasn't expecting a personal visit. Damon shook his hand briefly, nodding. We've had some matters surface that are best addressed face-to-face, he said. His tone was steady, respectful, but underneath it, a wire of tension stretched tight. Mason remained silent as he took a seat near the corner, placing the briefcase on the table without opening it. Across the room, already seated, was Carter Vale. Clean-shaven, silver-haired, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, Carter looked every bit the seasoned consultant. But as soon as his eyes met Damon's, the color drained slightly from his face. His jaw clenched. He didn't smile. I trust you've settled in well at Horizon, Damon said, taking the seat across from him. The question was casual, but the undertone was barbed. Carter nodded slowly. Quite well, thank you. The team here is efficiency, Damon echoed softly, leaning back in his chair. That's an interesting word for what we've discovered. Leonard glanced between the two men, confused. Is something going on I should be aware of? Damon didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave Mason a subtle nod. The former intelligence officer clicked open the briefcase and retrieved a silver tablet, placing it before Damon. With one tap, the screen lit up. Rows of data logs, intercepted messages, crew schedules, VIP manifests, all neatly categorized under a folder labeled Project Haven Wing Breach. Carter's fingers curled slowly around the armrests of his chair. Damon turned the tablet toward Leonard. We've been investigating a series of data leaks from our internal systems. What began as a disciplinary review turned into something much bigger. 3 crew members were linked to Horizon Air through indirect contact, but it was a note, buried inside a galley compartment, that gave us the name. Carter Vale. Leonard's eyes widened as he scanned the first few files. This can't be right. Unfortunately it is, Mason said, speaking for the first time, his voice cool and direct. The digital trail was faint but traceable. The metadata from the synced files confirmed that the leaks corresponded directly with Carter's arrival at Horizon. Some of these files pertain to unreleased flight routes, design schematics, and pricing algorithms from Skyreach's next-generation fleet. Leonard looked at Carter, stunned. "You told me the data you had was generic. Industry forecasts, nothing proprietary." Carter's throat moved as he swallowed. "I didn't think it would be traced back." "You only planned to destabilize Havenwing before it launched," Damon interrupted, his voice as sharp as a blade sheathed in silk. "You wanted to cripple our expansion before the public even knew what we were building." Carter's mask began to crack. "You forced me out, Damon. I gave years to Skyreach, and you let the board corner me into resigning." "You resigned," Damon said coldly, "because you were caught funneling confidential route data to private clients on the side. We let you leave quietly. But this was your second betrayal." Silence pressed heavy against the glass walls. The city below seemed distant, unreal. Leonard stood, his voice hardening. "Carter, as of this moment, your contract with Horizon is terminated. Legal will follow up." Carter rose slowly, a bitter smirk forming. "You think this ends here? You think Skyreach walks away untouched?" Damon met his gaze, unflinching. "No," he said softly. "I think Skyreach walks away stronger, for knowing who was willing to sink the ship from another deck." He turned to Mason. The security expert tapped the screen again. A live feed of the press briefing room downstairs flickered on, already buzzing with reporters. Damon stood. "I scheduled a joint announcement for today. We'll be going live in 5 minutes. The public deserves to know what trust looks like, and what betrayal costs." Carter froze. "You set me up." "No," Damon said, straightening his blazer. "You set yourself up the moment you forgot whose name was on the aircraft." He walked past Carter without another glance. Mason followed, leaving Carter alone in the boardroom with only his failures for company. Outside the room, the hallway felt brighter. A rush of clarity filled Damon's lungs. This wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning, measured, controlled, and delivered with the precision of a pilot landing in a storm. In the press room below, cameras flashed as Damon Marin stepped onto the stage. Leonard followed reluctantly, knowing what must be said. Behind them, the Skyreach insignia shone like a promise above betrayal. And as Carter watched the feed flicker across the boardroom screen, the last piece of his career cracked in silence. "Next time you mock a name, make sure it's not written on the jet you're flying." The sky itself seemed to echo the justice of quiet retribution. News of the exposure spread like wildfire through the aviation industry. Within hours of Damon Marin confronting Carter Vale in Horizon Air's polished, camera-lined conference room, the fallout began. Screens across airports, executive terminals, and newsrooms flashed the headlines. "Skyreach unmasks espionage plot. Former exec at center of leak." Before the sun had set on the East Coast, Horizon Air's board had released a carefully worded statement, distancing themselves from Carter Vale. The apology was public, precise, and rehearsed, pledging full cooperation with Skyreach's internal investigation and promising a recommitment to ethical partnership across the sector. But back at Skyreach headquarters, no one was celebrating. The executive boardroom, perched high above Ardent City's skyline with floor-to-ceiling windows, remained tense. Damon stood at the head of the oval-shaped table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. Around him sat his core leadership team, operations, security, legal, public relations, all of them waiting to hear his next move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand on the table. He didn't need to. "We're not going to chase blame," Damon said calmly, his voice carrying through the silent room like steady engine thrust before takeoff. "We're going to rebuild trust." The weight of those words lingered in the air. Mason Ryle, seated to Damon's right, gave a single approving nod. The rest of the team exchanged glances, relieved perhaps that this wouldn't become a witch hunt, but aware that Damon's focus had now shifted from exposure to restoration. Outside the glass, the city pulsed with life, cars crawling below like glowing veins, buildings lit with corporate ambition. Inside, the mood was different, focused, introspective. Damon didn't want retaliation. He wanted accountability, and he wanted to protect what Skyreach stood for. Later that evening, the warm hum of televisions echoed through the marble corridors of Skyreach Tower as media outlets replayed footage from the earlier confrontation. Caden sat cross-legged on the plush rug of the executive lounge, eyes locked on the screen. His navy suit jacket hung neatly on the back of the sofa. A cup of untouched hot chocolate rested on the table beside him. He watched as the broadcast replayed his father's calm takedown of Carter Vale, the unwavering tone, the silence that followed every word. Caden's young mind pieced together the larger truth, not just that his father was powerful, but that he was principled. Damon had exposed betrayal, yes, but more importantly, he had chosen not to let pride guide his hand. That realization stirred something deeper in Caden. It was the difference between force and grace. A knock on the glass door interrupted the quiet. Felix, the young flight attendant, stepped in. His uniform was crisp, but the nervous way he held his cap in both hands betrayed his unease. He glanced at Caden, then at Damon, who had just entered from the hallway. "Sir," Felix began, his voice low, "I know I've already apologized, but I wanted to come in person, to thank you." For not letting that moment define me, Damon regarded him for a long moment. The tension in the room shifted, and Caden leaned forward listening. "You stood by and let it happen," Damon said, not unkindly, "but you also spoke up when it counted." "That matters," Felix swallowed, shoulders tightening. "Still, I should have done more. I should have stopped him the first time." Damon walked toward the window, staring out at the Skyreach hangar in the distance, the same one where engineers now worked overtime to secure data, patch protocols, and review security clearances. Then he turned back to Felix. "I'm not going to punish honesty," he said. "I'm going to promote it." Felix blinked. "Sir?" "You're being promoted," Damon continued, voice clear and resolute. "You'll oversee first-class service training for new recruits." Starting next week, Felix's mouth opened, but no words came out. His hands tightened around his cap until his knuckles turned white. "I don't know what to say." Damon gave a small nod. "Say it by how you lead." Felix stepped back, stunned. Gratitude and disbelief warred on his face. He glanced at Caden, who offered a quiet smile, small but genuine. Felix returned it, then left without another word. As the door closed behind him, Damon turned to his son. "You see that?" he said. Caden nodded. "He didn't ask for it." "He earned it." Damon placed a hand on Caden's shoulder. "One man mocked a child to inflate himself," he said, his tone soft but full of meaning. "Another humbled himself to protect dignity." Outside, lights continued to blink on the runways. The city breathed. The story was no longer just about betrayal. It was about how people responded when the storm passed. Damon looked at his son proudly. "What began as insult now defines who we are. Sometimes justice doesn't roar, it restores." The applause erupted the moment Damon Marin stepped up to the podium, but his eyes were on the boy beside him. Cameras clicked and whirred. Reporters jostled for space in the sleek press hall of Skyreach headquarters, where banners reading Project Horizon Light, elevating culture through respect, framed the gleaming stage. A large digital display flickered behind them, showing footage from recent in-flight training sessions, smiling crew members, and the simple, powerful phrase that had become the company's new slogan, "Respect before service." Caden Marin, just 11, stood upright in his tailored navy suit, the same one from the flight that had sparked it all. The lights overhead reflected off his polished golden tie clip. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, though he kept his chin high. He could feel the weight of the room pressing on him, the importance of what his father had asked him to represent. Damon leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice steady and measured. "Today," he began, scanning the crowd with his usual composed intensity, "we don't just launch a new program. We commit to rebuilding the very soul of our service culture, starting with how we treat each other." The audience quieted. Every ear turned toward him. "The first-class experience," Damon continued, "doesn't begin with a meal, a reclined seat, or a warm towel. It begins with dignity, and that doesn't come from hierarchy, it comes from humanity." He paused, then turned toward Caden, placing a firm, steady hand on his son's shoulder. "This young man reminded us of that." Caden blinked once, then twice. The pressure swelled in his chest, but he refused to show fear. He remembered what Damon had told him backstage. "People don't follow speeches, Cade. They follow examples." So he nodded slightly, acknowledging the murmurs of support from the crowd, and stepped forward beside his father. In the back corner of the room, unnoticed by most, Felix stood silently behind the velvet curtain. The younger flight attendant wore his new uniform, sleek, silver-trimmed with a small gold pin shaped like wings at his collar. His recent promotion to head of first-class operations still felt unreal. But as he watched Caden speak with quiet resolve, Felix understood why Damon had chosen him. Not for perfection, but for integrity under pressure. "He's going to change more than flights," Felix whispered to himself, barely audible. "He's going to change people." Across town, far from the bright stage and flattering lights, a diner television buzzed above a cracked booth. A man in a plain work shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbows and hands stained faintly with floor wax, paused mid-mop. His eyes locked on the image on screen, Caden Marin standing proudly, the embodiment of what Trevor Knox had tried to belittle. Trevor set down his mop slowly. His gaze didn't waver. He watched the boy speak softly, clearly, respectfully. The very traits he once mocked now illuminated the screen. Around him, other patrons barely glanced up from their meals. But to Trevor, the moment landed like a stone in still water. His shoulders slumped. He thought of the arrogance that led him here, now working community service at a school cafeteria, scrubbing tiles and hauling crates. The pay was nothing. The dignity, worse. He turned back to his mop and began cleaning again, but the speech echoed in his head, louder than the hum of the fryer behind him. Back on stage, Damon's voice softened, more personal now. "After everything we uncovered," he said, his hand still on Caden's shoulder, "we had two choices: punish and forget, or learn and rebuild. We chose the latter." The room stirred with understanding. Even the press, so often hungry for drama, seemed moved by the sincerity in his tone. Damon stepped aside. "Now," he said gently, "our youngest ambassador has a few words." Caden took a half-step forward. The microphone seemed taller than he remembered. He reached up, adjusted it slowly, and let the silence settle. His heartbeat was loud in his ears. "My name is Caden Marin," he said, his voice small but steady, "and I didn't understand why people laughed at me that day. I was just dressed how my dad taught me, to show respect for myself and others. But someone didn't like that." A ripple moved through the crowd. Damon stayed still, his expression unreadable but alert. "That moment made me feel small. But I stayed quiet. And later, I found out that being quiet doesn't mean you're weak. It just means you're listening. And I listened to how people changed afterward. That's why I'm proud to stand here now." He paused. "Because respect isn't about age or job or clothes. It's about remembering everyone matters. Every seat matters." The applause rose slowly, then built into a warm, steady wave. Damon stepped beside him once more, not saying anything, but giving his son a subtle nod, one only the two of them would notice. Caden's chest swelled with pride, not from the clapping, but from that nod alone. As the press conference drew to a close, a screen behind them lit up with the official seal of Project Horizon Light and its mission: empathy, excellence, elevation. Caden's name sat beneath the title, Symbolic Ambassador. He would be featured in training videos, promotional materials, and more. But at that moment, Caden didn't care about any of that. He just cared that his voice, his presence, meant something. Backstage, Felix stood motionless, absorbing the moment. He knew what came next: rebuilding, retraining, reinforcing a culture that had grown arrogant with success. But, for the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt ready. Across the city, in the flickering glow of a corner diner, Trevor turned off the television. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply sat for a moment, staring at his own reflection in the dark screen. The sound of Caden's final words lingered in his ears. Every seat matters. He leaned back, eyes burning, not from anger, but from realization. And as he picked up the mop again, the truth hit him hard and cold. He hadn't just mocked a child, he had ignored a mirror. Felix's voice backstage still hung in the air, though he hadn't spoken again. That boy's going to change more than flights. He's going to change people. Redemption sometimes begins in the shadow of disgrace. The plane's engines hummed steadily as Caden Marin adjusted the cuff of his navy blazer, the cabin lights casting a soft amber glow across the first-class compartment. The air carried the quiet murmur of travelers settling in, but there was no fanfare this time, no whispers, no stares, no recognition of who the boy or his father truly were. To the crew, they were simply passengers like any other. Damon Marin sat by the window, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning the aisle with the calm alertness of a man who had learned that peace was only as strong as the vigilance guarding it. The new flight attendant, a young man named Ellis Ward, approached with an eager smile and a nervous grip on the beverage cart. His voice trembled slightly as he greeted them. "Evening, gentlemen. Would you like something to drink before we depart?" He was polite, careful, and his tone carried none of the arrogance Damon had once witnessed from Trevor Knox. When his gaze landed on Caden's attire, the perfectly knotted tie, the polished shoes, the small lapel pin of Skyreach's crest, he chuckled lightly. "You look sharp, sir," he said, his tone sincere. Caden looked up from fastening his seatbelt, a spark of warmth in his eyes. "Thank you," he replied, his voice calm but confident. "My dad says dressing well is just another form of self-respect." Ellis smiled wider, clearly taken by the boy's composure. Damon turned toward them, his face softening into quiet amusement as he watched the exchange. "Good advice," Ellis said, nodding respectfully before continuing down the aisle. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Damon leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. He listened to the subtle vibrations of the engines beneath his feet, each pulse reminding him of the thousands of moving parts that kept his company and his values airborne. For the first time in months, he allowed himself a moment of silence not born from tension, but from reflection. He had seen the worst of pride, the damage of mockery, and the corruption hidden in ambition. Yet tonight, sitting beside his son, he saw what remained after the storm: growth, grace, and the quiet power of example. The cabin dimmed as the aircraft lifted off, the city lights of Ardent fading beneath them. Caden gazed out the window, mesmerized by the glowing constellations below that mirrored the stars above. "Dad," he said after a pause, his voice thoughtful, "do you ever stop thinking about what happened?" Damon opened his eyes and looked at him. The boy's reflection in the glass appeared older somehow, not in age, but in understanding. "No," Damon said honestly. "Some things stay with you, especially when they teach you what kind of man you want to be." Caden nodded slowly, still watching the streaks of light vanish into clouds. "Are we still fixing what happened?" The question carried more weight than its simplicity suggested. Damon studied his son's profile. the determined eyes, the unshaken posture, and smiled faintly. "Always," he answered, "because there will always be someone who thinks respect is optional." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Caden could hear. "That's why people like you must remind them it's not." For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the engines became the rhythm of their thoughts. Damon glanced around the cabin, passengers reading quietly, attendants moving efficiently, everything peaceful and ordinary. Yet beneath the calm, he felt a familiar current, the same one that had run beneath every boardroom decision, every confrontation, every victory. It was the current of responsibility. The higher one rose, the heavier the air became, not because of altitude, but because of the weight of example. He turned back to the window, the reflection of his son beside him blending with the darkness beyond. In that mirrored space, Damon saw both the boy who had been mocked and the young man who had endured it with quiet grace. He remembered the humiliation, the anger, the corporate chaos that had followed, but more than that, he remembered the dignity that had endured through it all. He exhaled slowly, feeling a peace he hadn't known since that day. As the seatbelt sign dimmed, Ellis returned with 2 glasses of water. "Compliments of the crew," he said softly. "The captain wanted to thank you both for flying with us tonight." Damon smiled politely, but there was a flicker of recognition in the attendant's tone, as if he suspected who they truly were. Still, Damon said nothing. Power, he had learned, was never in being recognized. It was in knowing when not to demand it. When Ellis walked away, Caden turned toward his father again. "Do you think people really change, Dad?" Damon looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Some do," he said, "but change isn't about saying sorry. It's about becoming different when no one's watching." Caden absorbed the words quietly, his small hands folded over his briefcase. Outside, the clouds parted and moonlight streamed through the window, washing over both father and son in silver light. The reflection made them seem almost identical. 2 faces separated by years, joined by purpose. Damon placed a hand on Caden's shoulder, steady and warm. "You know," he murmured, "I used to think legacy was about what we build." "But I was wrong." Caden tilted his head curiously. "Then what is it about?" Damon's gaze remained on the endless sky. "It's about who we build." The plane cruised higher, the stars scattered like fragments of promise. Caden leaned back in his seat, his thoughts steady but alive with new understanding. Somewhere deep down he felt the invisible inheritance his father had been passing to him, not through wealth or name, but through choices, through moments like this one. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with meaning, with the unspoken bond of men who had faced storms and chosen grace over vengeance. Damon closed his eyes once more, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. Not the measured smile of a businessman, but the quiet smile of a man who understood peace. The engines roared softly beneath them, guiding the plane through the night sky. Caden watched his father's reflection fade into the dark horizon and whispered, almost to himself, "I'll remind them, Dad." "I promise." Damon opened his eyes, looked at his son, and nodded slowly. "I know you will." His voice was calm, steady, and filled with quiet conviction. Outside, lightning flickered faintly within distant clouds, a brief warning of storms still lingering beyond sight. But neither father nor son flinched. They had already weathered worse. Damon's gaze followed the streak of light until it vanished. He leaned back, his hand still resting on Caden's shoulder, and spoke softly, his words echoing like a vow sealed in the sky. "Legacies don't begin with power. They begin with example." A hush fell over the grand hall as the final sequence of Wings of Respect began to play on the colossal screen suspended above the stage. Ardent City Convention Hall, with its tiered velvet seats and arched glass ceiling, sat full to capacity. Journalists, pilots, cadets, executives, and curious civilians alike held their breath as the story unfolded. In the center of it all sat Caden Marin, now 13, dressed in a refined Navy suit almost identical to the one he had worn on that fateful flight. Beside him sat his father, Damon Marin, silent, composed, and focused. But his fingers were loosely clasped, his gaze sharpened with a mixture of reflection and restraint. On the screen, an actor portraying a younger Caden was being laughed at by Airline crew. The scene was filmed in stark, unforgiving lighting. Every smirk, every whispered insult echoed in the chamber like thunder. Caden shifted in his seat. Even now, though years had passed, the sting of that humiliation could still reach through the images. He clenched his jaw slightly, a quiet reflex, and felt Damon's hand rest gently on his shoulder. No words, just presence, just reminder. Then came the shift. The scene transitioned to Damon rising calmly from his seat on the flight, revealing his badge, his name, his authority. The crowd inside the hall exhaled as one, like a tide reversing course. The actor's voice, measured, firm, delivered Damon's now famous line, "Then allow me to reintroduce you to who earned this seat." Applause erupted, not because it was rehearsed or expected, but because truth, even when dramatized, still rang loud and unshakable. Caden watched the screen as if through a window to a past self, a version of him that had endured without fully understanding the impact he was making. That version had stayed quiet, kept his posture, smiled politely through mockery. And yet, it was that silence, that small boy in a too-big suit, that had pulled the thread on a scandal rooted in arrogance, betrayal, and espionage. The documentary didn't just tell a story. It built a mirror. It showed the before and the after, footage of the internal reforms, interviews with Felix, now leading Skyreach's first-class service division, speaking about dignity in the sky, commentary from board members who admitted they had never expected a child's experience to ignite a systemic overhaul, images of Damon standing at press conferences, not seeking credit, but demanding accountability. But what moved the audience most wasn't the exposure or the drama. It was the quiet strength in Caden's eyes, replayed again and again. Eyes that had held back tears, eyes that had seen through cruelty, eyes that had carried the weight of being mocked and still chosen grace. As the credits rolled, soft piano music filled the hall. The audience remained still, as though leaving would break something sacred. Caden lowered his gaze. He hadn't expected this. Not the attention, not the reverence. Just the memory would have been enough. But now, this retelling had given others a piece of it too. A weight shared. The lights brightened slowly. Applause followed, first hesitant, then swelling. Caden sat back, the noise rushing over him like wind across open skies. A group of young cadets, boys, no older than Caden had been during the incident, approached cautiously. Their uniforms were pressed, their shoes polished, but what stood out most was the way they looked at him. Not like a celebrity, like a mirror. One of them, a brown-haired boy with a badge that read LST, stepped forward. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "You made us proud to dream higher?" Caden blinked. For a second, he didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to being seen like this, like a symbol. He gave a small, shy smile and nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. Damon, watching the exchange, placed his hand gently on his son's shoulder again, this time leaning closer. His voice was low but deliberate, meant only for Caden, yet heavy with truth. "Remember this, Cade. Sometimes we're tested not to show our weakness, but to uncover our strength." The applause swelled again, but Damon's eyes misted, not from pride, but from gratitude. When dignity takes flight, even storms must bow beneath its wings. The hangar door groaned as it slid open, the light from outside cutting across the polished floor like a blade. Caden Marin stepped into the cavernous space, his footsteps echoing softly as he approached the centerpiece of the room, a fully preserved Skyreach AR-90 jet, the same aircraft that had once carried an 11-year-old boy in a navy blue suit through the storm of ridicule and into the heart of an unexpected reckoning. He walked alone. The air inside was cool and quiet, the kind of stillness that held memory like a sealed vault. Over the years, the jet had been restored to perfection. Its titanium frame gleamed under overhead lights, the Skyreach insignia brushed freshly in gold and deep blue. Everything about it whispered legacy, but Caden didn't look at the brand or the paint. He focused on the row of first-class windows, pausing in front of one in particular. He knew exactly which seat it was. Second from the front, right window, 2A. He ran a hand across the fuselage, fingertips brushing the metal as if it might speak back. His expression was unreadable, nostalgic, maybe, but beneath the surface was something harder to define. Not bitterness, not regret, a calm knowing. He closed his eyes. That day had once haunted him, not because of the insults, but because of the silence he'd chosen. It wasn't weakness. It had been instinct. And now, years later, that silence had become a lesson carried far beyond altitude or airspace. It had shaped the man he became, one who listened more than he spoke, who mentored more than he competed, and who never forgot that dignity, once tested, either broke or forged. A voice broke through his thoughts. "You're here early," said Lewis Crane, now the senior operations director at Skyreach. He stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, but his tone was casual. Caden turned with a faint smile. Didn't want this to feel like a ceremony. Just wanted to remember it properly, Lewis walked forward, glancing briefly at the aircraft before focusing on Caden. People still talk about it, you know. The day you boarded a plane and ended up changing how we train our crews, how we protect our name, how we see leadership. I didn't do any of that alone, Caden replied, voice steady. My father, he made the choices that mattered. Lewis raised an eyebrow. He reacted to something wrong. You're the reason it was ever noticed. Caden didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the jet, placing his palm fully against its side. The metal was cold. I used to hate this plane, he admitted quietly. For a long time, it reminded me of humiliation. I couldn't walk through an airport without remembering Trevor's voice, or the way people laughed under their breath. Even after all the success, it still lived somewhere inside me. Lewis nodded slowly. What changed? Caden lowered his hand and looked back at him. I realized the memory never changed. I did. A long pause stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of a floor polisher outside. Then Lewis spoke again, this time with a tone more serious. You know the board wants to name the mentorship program after you. I heard. They want to make it official on Founders Day. Invite press, donors, even Horizon's CEO might show. Caden gave a dry chuckle. That'll be interesting. You okay with it? Caden hesitated, then nodded. If it helps young professionals get through doors without proving they belong before they speak, then yes. Lewis tapped his clipboard thoughtfully. He'd be proud. I hope so, Caden said, then turned his eyes back toward the window where he once sat. I used to think strength came from fighting back, but sometimes it's the people who sit still, who breathe through the worst moments, that change the most. They stood in silence a while longer before Lewis said, I'll leave you to it. Caden waited until he heard the door close behind him. Alone again, he walked along the length of the aircraft until he reached the boarding stairs, which had been rolled into place for maintenance. Slowly, he climbed them. Inside the cabin, the scent of preserved leather and faint cleaning polish lingered. Everything was just as it had been. First-class seats in rows of 2, overhead lights dimmed to a soft gold hue, the faint hum of the ventilation system creating a quiet rhythm. He walked the aisle slowly until he reached seat 2A. Lowering himself into it, he rested both hands on the armrests and looked out the window. The same view, the same sky, only he was no longer the same boy. He thought of Damon, of the way his father had handled the moment, not with anger, but with precision, how he'd used silence like a blade and truth like a parachute. That strength had been passed down, not through genetics or blood, but through the example of what it meant to stand tall without stepping on others. A knock at the cabin door startled him slightly. It was Mason Ryle, older now, still sharp-eyed. "Didn't think I'd find you here," Mason said, stepping inside. "Figured you'd be out running one of your companies." "I take detours," Caden replied with a smirk. This one felt overdue. Mason walked past the seats and leaned against the frame near the cockpit. "Your father had vision. But you made it personal. That's why it stuck." Caden looked around the cabin. "Funny how something small turns into something lasting. I was just a kid in a suit. Now it's a story with chapters." "It's more than a story," Mason said. "It's a reminder that culture can't be written. It has to be lived." Caden stood up. "Then let's make sure they live it." He walked toward the exit, pausing only once more at the top of the stairs. He glanced over his shoulder, giving the aircraft one final look. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel shame. Only a deep, anchored peace. Then, almost in a whisper, as if speaking to the boy he once was, he said, "Every flight must land, but what it carries in its wake defines how high it truly soared." He thought he was humiliating a passenger's son. Seconds later, he was apologizing to the CEO. If you stand for dignity, equality, and accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racism, prejudice, and the dangers of judging others by appearance. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke reflection, and inspire empathy, equality, and accountability in the face of discrimination.